Okay, now why don't you grab the phosphorus limestone out of your box there. That's another one which is a biologically created rock. And what happens here is picture the Great Barrier Reef or coral. And you can look it up on the internet. The coral is so gorgeous. It's on the bottom of very shallow, warm waters like in the Caribbean and parts of Texas, actually. There's I think there's a coral outcrop about 80 miles off Houston called the Flower Gardens. And so where the water is shallow and it's warm and there's not a lot of energy in it, it's kind of not a lot of waves in motion, and the sunlight can get through it. What happens is, so here's the surface of the water. In the water itself, as you've seen, there's all sorts of living plants. There's plants and animals that are tiny, 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 microscopic, that are all in the what's called the water column. So they're all like living in the water. And they're living over a coral reef. You've heard of that, you know what that is. And most of that are the corals and sponges and all sorts of little organisms that live on the bottom. And of course, there are some fish that live in the coral reefs. Well, a lot like coal, as these animals in the water column die, their shells all fall to the bottom. And we're all lucky because those shells are made of limestone. Most of the coral, their shells are made of limestone. And as they die, they also flop over just like the coal did, the plants. And then another set of coral will be on top of that one. And then ultimately that one dies. And another one grows right on top of it. So you have the limestone from these animals and plants that have limestone shells falling to the bottom of the ocean on top of this coral reef, which is already very, very strong limestone because all the corals have shells. And that all finally becomes compacted, just like the coal, into something we call a limestone with fossils. Now, when you pick up that limestone with fossils, you should be able to see little fossils throughout the whole matrix. The rock is still limestone and the shells are limestone. So that's another kind of sedimentary rock. So remember, and you don't really have to remember a lot of these details, but you just have to remember that there's different kinds of sedimentary rocks. The ones that you know are called the clastics, as I just said earlier. CLASTIC. And that's the sandstones and the conglomerates and the mudstone and all that. And then number two, we have these ones that are formed when the water evaporates. So those are evaporites. Again, you don't have to remember these names. Whoops. Evap or right. And it doesn't matter if you remember that word. It's just that you know that there are kinds of rocks that are formed when the water evaporates, leaving the minerals. And then finally, the one that we just talked about, the coal and the limestone with fossils, those are organic rocks because those are sedimentary rocks that are formed by animals, plants, their shells, all collecting at the bottom of a body of water, getting crushed and turning into a rock. We'll talk about that maybe in the future, how that happens. But right now, it's not important. What is important